The first sound wasn't his voice. It was the sharp crack of a folder snapping shut. Then came the words that cleaved the air like glass breaking. Effective immediately, Adrian Cole, Chief Systems Architect, is terminated. For a heartbeat, the boardroom held its breath. Charts froze on the projector. Pens hovered above notebooks. No one blinked.
Before we go on, where are you watching from? Drop your city or your country in the comments. And if you believe in dignity and justice, do not forget to hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we are glad you are here.
At the head of the table, Marcus Hale, our newly crowned Chief Executive Officer, delivered my execution with the calm detachment of a surgeon. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at me. To him, I was an obstacle, not a person. I felt the blood rise hot behind my ears. 8 years of building Apex Nova's modular platform, line by line, clause by clause, reduced to a single sentence. The humiliation wasn't private. It was a spectacle. Every director, every vice president in the room, watched as I was erased. Still, I didn't give Marcus the satisfaction of outrage. I simply gathered my notes, lifted my chin, and whispered one word that unsettled the silence. Thank you. A few people shifted uncomfortably, mistaking it for surrender. But it wasn't. They didn't know what I knew. The silence after my firing followed me like a shadow. It stretched down the hallway, into the elevator, and out into the parking lot where I sat gripping my steering wheel long after the engine should have started. For 8 years I had been the anchor, the one who steadied the storm, and in less than a minute, Marcus Hale, the new CEO, had cut me loose in front of the very people who once praised me as indispensable. What I didn't expect was how quickly the chaos would ripple through the team. By the next morning, my phone lit up with messages, not of support, but of confusion. Ethan Ward wrote, "Are we even allowed to keep working on the code?" Maya Lin added, "HR says everything is paused until new leadership is confirmed." Ryan Cross, ever the cynic, simply messaged, "Guess we're disposable after all." Their words bled with exhaustion and disbelief. These were some of the brightest engineers I had ever worked with, and they suddenly sounded like soldiers abandoned mid-battle. I stared at each text, my chest tightening. The emptiness was unbearable. I had fought so hard to protect them, to carve out a space where creativity thrived and deadlines didn't kill souls. Now they were drifting, untethered, questioning whether their careers had collapsed overnight because of one executive's arrogance. I felt guilty. Had I failed them? Had my silence in that boardroom condemned us all? Doubt seeped into every corner of my thoughts. I replayed the moment I whispered "thank you" over and over, wondering if it sounded cowardly, if they believed I had simply accepted defeat. For the first time in years, I questioned my own instincts. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe leadership could be replaced by someone with the right smile and the right connections. Then, at 4:15 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Leo Grant, the intern. He wasn't supposed to know anything beyond QA protocols and bug reports. His text was short, almost casual. "They don't know who holds the original patent. Do they?" I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. Of all people, Leo had glimpsed the truth. The silence that had felt like a tomb suddenly cracked open. He was right. They didn't know. Marcus didn't know. The board didn't know. Not one of them understood that during the budget cuts 3 years earlier, I had secured the modular patent under a separate entity. Redline Systems, my entity, held the original design, the licensing rights, and the framework that powered everything. They weren't sitting in Apex Nova's vaults. For a moment, they were sitting in mine. The emptiness eased. Doubt still lingered. But beneath it sparked something I hadn't felt since the firing. Leverage. Leo's question reminded me that the game wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. That night, my apartment looked more like an evidence locker than a home. Contracts, binders, and scribbled notes were stacked high across the kitchen table, spilling onto the floor in uneven piles. The lamp above me flickered, casting long shadows over the mess. I could almost hear Marcus Hale in his glass-walled penthouse across town, sipping something expensive while rehearsing soundbites for tomorrow's investor call. He had the skyline. I had peeling paint and papers stained with coffee rings. The contrast was almost comical. I sat there in my chair, wrapped in silence. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes the air feel heavier than it should. My phone buzzed occasionally with another anxious message from one of the engineers, but I didn't answer. I didn't have comfort to give. All I had were the files I dragged out of storage boxes, remnants of every contract negotiation, every budget meeting, every moment I'd fought tooth and nail to keep our project alive. The loneliness was sharp. I had given years of my life to Apex Nova, and in return, I was discarded like a worn-out circuit board. The thought clawed at me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was done. But every time that doubt whispered, another voice pushed back. The one that had kept me awake through all-nighters. The one that had fought through budget cuts. The one that refused to let my work vanish under someone else's name. My eyes burned as I flipped through folder after folder. It felt pointless, like digging through ashes, until I opened one yellowed envelope tucked beneath a stack of old quarterly reports. Inside was a printed email timestamped 3 years earlier. I remembered it instantly. Finance had announced a budget realignment. Translation: our team was about to be gutted. That was the night I had stayed up until dawn, drafting an alternate plan, one that routed our modular system through a separate legal entity. My pulse quickened as I read the words again, this time slower, letting each sentence cut through the fog of exhaustion. I had been more than a title on an org chart. As chief systems architect, I had been the spine of this company. I was the one who negotiated survival when budgets collapsed, the one who coded through blackouts, the one who made Apex Nova's $250 million flagship platform possible. I carried the late nights, the skipped family milestones, the endless fight to prove that work done in a cramped lab mattered more than empty speeches upstairs. Marcus had none of that weight. His resume was slides and sound bites, polished in consulting firms where nothing real was ever built. He strode into the CEO's chair armed with jargon, synergy, streamlining, low-hanging fruit, as though words could replace the years I had carved into steel and silicon. He was a man intoxicated by titles, blind to the substance beneath them. That morning crystallized the truth. Marcus believed firing me was efficiency. He thought he had won, but while the board stared at me like a casualty, I felt something sharper than despair. Certainty. The certainty that I had prepared for this very betrayal. And Marcus Hale, CEO or not, had no idea how much power he had just handed back to me. I let the memory sit for a moment, then began to sort through the contracts for leverage, for loopholes, for anything that would buy time. 12 days earlier, during a routine systems audit, the first structural cracks had appeared in one of our demonstration modules. I remembered how the demo had degraded. What began as a 5-minute stall stretched to 15 minutes, then to 30 minutes before the system finally recovered. If it recovered at all. Everything in that room, the boardroom, the investor decks, the glossy slide headlines, depended on those modules. If the modules were unstable, the platform's value could tilt fast. I leaned into that possibility, letting the math of risk and reputation and legal exposure assemble itself into a plan.
Before we go on, where are you watching from? Drop your city or your country in the comments. And if you believe in dignity and justice, do not forget to hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we are glad you are here.
Outside, the city hustled on as if nothing had happened. Inside, I gathered my evidence, my patience, and the quiet, cold joy of someone who knows how systems fail, and how to make sure the right people feel the consequences. The game had changed, and so had I. Buried halfway down the email was a clause so ordinary it almost looked harmless. In the event of termination of project funding or leadership oversight, all rights revert to the original architect until full reintegration. I set the paper down, my hands trembling. That was it. The thread no one else had noticed. Marcus thought stripping me of my title gave him control. He thought public humiliation erased years of preparation. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their act of cutting me off had triggered the very clause that placed the patent squarely back in my hands. The room was still small, still cluttered, still suffocating. But suddenly it felt less like a prison and more like a command center. Alone. Yes. Exhausted. Absolutely. Yet beneath the ache sat something harder, sharper. Resolve. They had just handed me the key. The first crack in Marcus Hale's empire arrived on a Thursday morning, precisely 12 days after my firing. I wasn't there in person, but I didn't need to be. Word travels fast in tech, faster still when something goes wrong in front of money. The investors had flown in from 3 cities, squeezed into Apex Nova's sleek glass auditorium for the highly choreographed product demo. Marcus had promised them a flawless performance, the kind of show that convinces cautious men in suits to loosen the strings on billion-dollar checks. What they got was silence. The demo dashboard lit up, then flickered, then froze on a single line of text glowing in sterile gray across a white screen. License authorization expired. At first, no one seemed to understand what it meant. The room buzzed with polite confusion, the kind that usually smooths over small technical glitches. Marcus forced a laugh, the kind that stretched too thin, then waved to the engineering team at the back. "Just a hiccup," he called out. 5 minutes, but 5 minutes turned into 15, 15 into 30. Every click produced the same result. License authorization expired. I was at home in my cramped apartment, watching the updates roll in through a private Slack channel my old team still hadn't removed me from. Ethan Ward typed, "They're sweating. Ops can't access staging." Maya Lynn added a single emoji, a lock. I leaned back in my chair, the corners of my mouth tugging upward despite myself. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the slip. In the middle of the confusion, Ellen, the director of operations, raised her voice over the hum of nervous whispers. "Wait," she said, holding a tablet aloft. "Are we saying we've actually lost control of the platform?" The words sliced through the room. Investors turned their heads in unison, eyes narrowing. Marcus's smile cracked. The carefully polished mask faltered. For the first time, he looked less like a CEO and more like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Of course not," he stammered, tugging at his cufflinks. "We have redundancies. Everything is fine." But his voice betrayed him. It wavered on the last syllable, just enough to send a ripple of doubt through the crowd. I imagined him then, standing in his tailored suit under the harsh auditorium lights, sweat gathering beneath his collar, while executives whispered and investors checked their watches. I sat miles away in a second-hand chair at a cluttered table, feeling a quiet current of triumph pulse through my veins. This was the power of preparation, the reward for reading every line of every contract when no one else bothered. They thought my firing had ended the story. What they didn't realize was that cutting me loose had triggered the very clause that turned the system into a locked vault, one only I could open. I didn't gloat aloud. I didn't post cryptic messages online. I simply folded my arms, breathed in the silence of my apartment, and let the satisfaction settle deep in my chest. For the first time since that boardroom ambush, I didn't feel erased. I felt inevitable. The day after the demo collapsed, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately: Human Resources. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to let it buzz into silence to remind them that I owed them nothing, but curiosity tugged harder. What excuse would they spin now? "Adrian?" The voice chirped, polished and overly cheerful. "How are you holding up?" "We've been so concerned. The word landed like a joke. Where was their concern when Marcus cut me down in front of the board? Where was it when the team spiraled into panic? When the system began slipping through their fingers? I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, not out of need, but out of control. "I'm fine," I said flatly. Good. The rep rushed on as if afraid I'd hang up. "Listen, the last few days have been challenging, but leadership has been talking, and we feel it would be mutually beneficial if you came back. We'd love to restore continuity." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. Mutually beneficial. Restore continuity. Pretty phrases wrapped around desperation. They weren't calling because they valued me. They were calling because they were drowning. I pictured Marcus pacing in his corner office, demanding HR fix this mess. They probably rehearsed this call, choosing phrases that sounded warm but not apologetic, urgent but not desperate. What they didn't realize was that every syllable dripped with fear. "You want me back?" I asked. "Yes," she said quickly. "The investors are unsettled and the team clearly respects you. This is about stability." "Of course." We'd be happy to discuss adjustments to your compensation. And there it was, the bait. Money. The universal bandage they thought could patch any wound. They believed I could be bought, that my silence, my loyalty, my architecture could be sold back to them with the right number of zeros. I almost laughed instead. I let the silence stretch until she shifted uncomfortably. Then I spoke slowly, carefully, each word sharpened to a blade. "You don't have enough money," I said. She stammered. I'm sorry. "You don't have enough money to buy back the truth," I continued. "Not the sleepless nights, not the years I spent protecting a system your executives never understood. Not the patent you tried to bury, and certainly not my silence." The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing quick and shallow, searching for a script that didn't exist. For the first time since Marcus's ambush, I felt no trace of doubt, only clarity. They wanted me back because they finally understood. The foundation was mine, not theirs. I ended the call before she could recover. No shouting, no gloating, just a clean break. My voice steady, my hands calm. They thought power lived in the CEO's office, but that day, I knew the truth. Power lived in the refusal to be bought. 2 days after I hung up on HR, an email slipped into my inbox with a subject line that made me pause. Invitation to discuss strategic alignment. The sender wasn't Apex Nova. It was a name I hadn't seen in years. Ardent Dynamics, one of our fiercest competitors. I stared at it for a long minute, my finger hovering over delete. It smelled too convenient, too perfectly timed. The system had barely stumbled, the board was scrambling, and now a rival wanted a conversation. Red flags everywhere. Still, curiosity is a stubborn thing. I opened it. The message was short, almost cryptic. "We understand the current turbulence. If you're open to dialogue, we'd like to meet. C. Dalton, Chris Dalton." The name hit me like a memory jolt. He had been one of ours once, a senior engineer with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. Years ago, Marcus had dismissed him in a restructuring, calling him unmanageable. Chris had laughed bitterly, said Marcus wouldn't know innovation if it bit him, and walked out. Now he was representing Ardent. My instinct screamed caution. Rivals don't reach out of kindness. They reach for leverage. Still, I agreed to coffee in a quiet cafe on the edge of downtown, the kind of place where the music was too soft and the waitstaff didn't eavesdrop. Chris looked older. Lines carved around his eyes, but his grin was the same, half amusement, half challenge. "Adrian Cole," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Didn't think I'd see the day you'd be on the outside looking in." "Life surprises," I answered evenly. He chuckled. Marcus always did have a talent for driving out the ones who actually matter. First me, now you. Though I'd say you built a hell of a lot more before he shoved you aside. I studied him, searching for the angle. "You didn't ask me here to reminisce." "You're right," Chris said, leaning in. "Ardent wants what you built. We've followed the fallout. Investors whisper, clients doubt. But you and I both know the system doesn't move without you." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression still. "What makes you so sure?" That grin again, sharper this time. He pulled a tablet from his bag and slid it across. On the screen was a copy of the Apex Nova licensing document, the same contract I had drafted 3 years earlier. He tapped a clause highlighted in yellow. "Marcus doesn't know, does he? That you're the only one who can activate the modules. Without you, it's just a shell." For a moment, the cafe noise dimmed, as if the world held its breath. I glanced at the words I already knew by heart. Clause 721, the oversight clause. My clause. Chris sat back, satisfied. "So, Adrian, the question isn't whether the system works. It's whether you want it to work for them or for someone else." I sipped my coffee, masking the storm inside. Caution coiled tight around my ribs, but beneath it, curiosity flickered. For the first time, someone outside Apex Nova spoke the truth aloud, and that changed everything. The morning headlines almost made me laugh. Apex Nova restores stability, system back online. Marcus must have fed the story to the press himself, plastering his face across every outlet as the savior who tamed the storm. He strutted before the board that day, declaring the system fully restored thanks to the heroic efforts of DevOps. He spoke in clipped confidence, his voice full of authority, as if the clause I had written 3 years earlier didn't exist for a few hours. People believed him. The board stopped panicking. Investors relaxed. Even some of my old team messaged me in confusion. Ethan Ward asked, "Did he actually fix it?" Maya Lin sent a question mark. Nothing more. I stared at the screen, my stomach tight. Marcus was playing with illusions. And illusions can be dangerous if left unchallenged. But I knew better. A system isn't restored by ignoring contracts or pretending licenses don't matter. Whatever he was running was a facade, a hollow shell designed to fool those who didn't know where to look. Less than 24 hours later, it happened again. At exactly 9:17 a.m., the system collapsed. Not a hiccup, not a temporary freeze, but complete failure. Demo environments, client sandboxes, even the investor testbed went dark. Screens across the building lit up with the same line of text I'd seen before. License authorization expired. Inside Apex Nova's offices, panic erupted. I heard about it through Ryan Cross, who sent me a frantic message. He's losing it. They can't access anything, not even staging. By mid-morning, the news had already leaked. Reporters who had praised Marcus hours earlier were now circling like sharks, questioning how a supposedly restored platform could fail again so catastrophically. In the boardroom, chaos reigned. Marcus tried to bluff, shouting about sabotage and technical glitches, but the faces staring back at him weren't buying it anymore. Someone demanded proof. Someone else demanded logs. That's when the truth cracked open. The so-called fix he had paraded was nothing more than a shallow demo environment. No real functionality, no legal authorization, nothing sustainable. A senior director finally said it aloud. "You misled us. This wasn't a restoration. It was theater." Marcus's face drained of color. The board's patience, already thin, snapped. Investors began pulling calls. Partners froze negotiations. The man who had sauntered into his CEO role full of swagger now looked like a cornered animal, eyes darting, sweat gathering along his collar. I sat in my apartment watching it unfold in real time through updates and whispers. For the first time, it wasn't my chaos to carry. It was his. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect itself from hands that didn't belong. Marcus Hale had just been unmasked as a fraud in front of everyone who once believed him. When the call from the board came, I wasn't surprised. The system's second collapse had left them with no choice. What did surprise me was how quickly the tone shifted from dismissive to desperate. They wanted me in the executive chamber by morning. I arrived early, walking past walls where employees pretended not to stare. The air felt charged, like everyone was waiting for a verdict. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was brittle. Half the directors were red-faced with frustration, the other half pale with fear, and Marcus Hale, the man who had humiliated me in front of this very table, stood near the doorway like a guard dog trembling on its leash. "Adrian," he began, his voice cracking just enough to betray him. "There's no need for this. The situation is under control." "We don't—" "Sit down, Marcus," one of the directors snapped. He flinched but didn't move. I didn't spare him a glance. My focus was on the long table and the rows of faces suddenly stripped of arrogance. "Thank you for coming," the chairman said carefully, as if each word might fracture. "We'd like to discuss a path forward." I placed my folder on the table, deliberately calm. "I'm not here to ask for my job back," I said. "Let's make that clear." A murmur swept the room. They expected bargaining, maybe an apology, maybe a demand for compensation. Instead, I kept my voice level, my gaze steady. "I will not return to Apex Nova. I will not restore your access. What I will do is sell the patent." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut skin. One director dropped his pen. Another inhaled too loudly. The chairman's jaw locked as he struggled to process what he had just heard. "You can't. You don't have the authority." Marcus almost shrieked. But the documents in front of me said otherwise. Their signatures, their approvals, their oversight lapses, every detail etched into black and white. The truth was undeniable, and they knew it. I leaned back in my chair, the chill of my certainty filling the room. This isn't a negotiation. It's an outcome. The boardroom's shock still lingered in my mind when I stepped into the marble lobby of Ardent Dynamics 2 days later. The air smelled of polished ambition, new carpets, fresh paint, the quiet hum of people who weren't scrambling to cover up a collapse. For the first time since Marcus had cut me down, I walked into a room not as a cast-off, but as the person holding the keys. Chris Dalton was waiting. The same sharp grin on his face. He didn't bother with small talk. "They know you won," he said. "The only question left is whether you'll let them live with the ruins or let us build something better." In the conference room upstairs, the contract lay open. Numbers written so large they almost looked unreal. $1.1 billion. My name printed neatly at the top. No longer attached to Apex Nova, but to me alone. Signing would mean cutting the last tie, ending the sleepless nights spent fighting for a company that had discarded me. I let my hand hover over the page. Money wasn't the problem. Power rarely is. What nagged at me was purpose. I hadn't poured years of my life into code just to see it twisted into a weapon of greed, no matter which corporation held the reins. So I made a choice. With Chris watching, I slid a second page across the table. My clause, my condition. "The system will be sold," I said. "Yes, but only with one stipulation. I will serve as chief advisory architect, not an employee, not a figurehead, but the guardian of how the technology is used." Chris raised his brows, then slowly nodded. "Protecting your work even after you walk away. I should have expected nothing less." When the pen finally touched paper, a weight lifted from my chest. Liberation didn't come in the form of numbers on a check. It came in reclaiming ownership over my creation, in choosing who deserved it and on what terms. I signed with steady hands, decisive and calm. Apex Nova had tried to erase me. Instead, I had written myself into history on my own terms. 12 days. That's all it took for Apex Nova to unravel. The headlines hit first: patent lost. Apex Nova collapses. Then came the numbers. Brutal in their precision. The stock plummeted. Billions were shaved off the company's value in a single morning. Partners fled. Contracts dissolved. The empire Marcus Hale had boasted about crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. The man who had once smirked while stripping me of my title was now reduced to a cautionary tale whispered across boardrooms. The CEO who didn't read the fine print. I watched it unfold with a quiet sense of inevitability. The same people who had applauded my dismissal now scrambled to distance themselves from Marcus. Shareholders demanded his resignation, and the board, cornered by their own negligence, forced him out. The final image remains etched in my mind, a press conference, cameras flashing in a frenzy. Marcus sat off to the side, hollow-eyed, his tie loose. His shoulders slumped as though the air had been pulled from his lungs. For once, the man who thrived on spotlights shrank from them. And then there was me. I stepped into the glare of the cameras, my step steady, my posture unbroken. The reporters shouted my name, the lenses followed my every move, and the contract waited before me. I lifted the pen, the weight of Aetnum condensed into that single moment. Flashbulbs ignited, bathing me in light, and for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing pulling me down. No shame, no doubt, only pride sharp and blazing.